And I think we're live already here. Okay. So, good evening, everybody. This is Scott Roberts and Shelley Bonus, and with our special guest, Basil Hero. And Basil is, he's an award-winning investigative reporter for NBC, right?
Yes.
Yep. And he has written this amazing book called The Mission of a Lifetime. And it's lessons from the men who went to the moon. And it's a fantastic book. We are very happy to have you here, Basil. You have interviewed with Dan Rather. Who else?
Oh, gosh.
A lot of people, right?
I've been on Jane Pauley's CBS Sunday Morning, MSNBC, and also the business news of Fox News with Neil Cavuto.
Oh, wonderful.
Wonderful. It's a nice group of people who've put me on their shows, and I've been most appreciative.
Yeah, well, fantastic. We're very appreciative to have you.
And very appreciative that you wrote this book.
Well, thank you, Shelley.
It's emotional, it's moving, and it is historical, and in no way hysterical. Okay. Yeah, it's really great. You're a wonderful writer.
Thanks. I appreciate that.
Yep.
I was just going to say that I think that the way you communicated this at many different levels and made not only the emotions but the technical things clear makes it a fascinating book and historical for those of us who love these missions.
Well, I tried to make it accessible for folks.
You did.
So this was my one of my major hopes for the book, so that it would be interesting and readable for those people, who don't know much about space. So, and there are plenty of people who they're like, sort of first time coming to it for the first time, and so that was one of my hopes. So,
yeah. So, Basil, how did you plan this book? And I'm very curious how you got access to all these astronauts. I know that you have had a lifelong interest in the mission to the moon and Apollo and all of that. You grew up watching the whole program go down. Both of us did too, and I know that it had huge influence on our lives, but. What was the whole process of you getting this book done?
Well, it started really for me, back in grade school when they would, wheel out the television sets in the hallway so that we could watch the Mercury and the Gemini launches. And of course, by the time I was 14 years old, 1969, that was the moon landing. And I had always maintained an interest in the program from that day that I saw Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin take their very first steps. So I got my hands on every book that I could about the program. And I remember reading the New York Times the day after they landed, and they had a special section. It was like a 2 to 4 page section, in which they interviewed the thought leaders of the day and what they thought the impact of the moon landing would be on everything from philosophy to science. And those were the questions that really intrigued me. While I was interested in the missions, per se, I wanted to delve and dive into the kind of existential questions, which really not very many authors have done with the astronauts. And so, my next door neighbor happened to be one of the foremost space historians, a gentleman named Bill Burroughs, who was also a former New York Times and Wall Street Journal reporter. And he wound up teaching journalism at NYU for 30 some odd years. And so, I told him what it was I was trying to do with this potential book. And he saw the value in it. And I said, Bill, how do I get to the 24 men who went to the moon. And at that point, several years ago, there were only 12 left. And so he put me in touch with one of the shuttle astronauts, Tom Jones, who was intrigued with what I was doing. And he reached out to Andy Turnage, who was the executive director of the Association of Space Explorers. And he sent out an email blast to their members, all, former and current astronauts. And the first one who actually responded to Andy was Bill Anders. And Bill Anders is the one who took the famous Earthrise photo, which helped launch the environmental movement. And so Anders' archivist contacted me and said, well, General Anders would like to know what it is that you're going to do that hasn't already been done. And he wanted a 2-page memo and exactly what the book would cover. And I told him that I wanted to address everything from the God issue to how they were impacted by their lunar exploration, and to touch on the issues that other authors were really kind of scared to get into. And so he liked that. And he invited me out to his home in Washington, and we spent a day and a half together. And then he picked up the phone and called Frank Borman, who was his crewmate on Apollo 8.
Wow, okay.
And Borman was impressed, and Borman called Jim Lovell, who, of course, was made more famous by Apollo 13. And so that really was the genesis of it.
Right.
Each one was recommending me to the other. And, it was really passing an acid test there. And so that was the long and the short of it. And I'm thankful to those three, frankly, for continuing to pick up the phone to others. And so, we discussed in this book everything from climate change to the future of space travel to, leadership lessons and the extraordinary organizational accomplishment of managing the moonshot. And in fact, I'm going out on Thursday to speak to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory folks with a presentation on the leadership issue. So there's a lot for one to sink one's teeth into in this book. It doesn't get very technical. I don't get into the details of the mission as much as, diving into the heads of these guys and trying to extract, some gems, and also their wives, quite frankly, who wound up being as interesting, if not more, than some of I came to refer to them as the Eagles.
Right.
Because they are still, here they are in their late 80s, early 90s. And what impressed me, you look at their eyes and the alertness is still there. And they just reminded me of eagles. And of course, they put the eagle on their mission patches.
Yes.
And of course, the lunar module that, Buzz Aldrin and Armstrong, flew down to the surface was named the Eagle.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
The religious question and the philosophical questions that you broached,
yes,
I think are extremely profound. We've never heard or read those individual thoughts before. Mm-hmm. How did you approach that, and how did you feel personally when you were receiving that information?
Well, it was fascinating, really, to see the variety of reactions and responses from the Eagles. Probably I found the most jolting in a positive way was Jim Lovell's.
Yes.
And Lovell almost didn't make it back from Apollo 13.
Right.
And what he said to me was, he said, after 50 years of reflection, I've come to the conclusion that we don't go to heaven when we die. We go to heaven when we are born. And I thought to myself as he was saying it, I was like, wow, that is an extraordinary statement. I certainly had never heard of it. And after the interview, I Googled the phrase, you don't go to heaven when you die, you go to heaven when you're born. I couldn't find it anywhere. And so I picked up the phone and I called the dean of the Yale Divinity School. And I said, Dean Sterling, have you ever heard such a formulation before? And you were, in the 2,000 years of Christian history, have any of the great thinkers or religious scholars ever uttered anything like this? And his answer was no. And the conclusion that he came to was that the only way that Lovell could have arrived at this conclusion was by going to the moon. Oh. And what was it that was universal to all of the lunar explorers and the Eagles? It was the fact that they concluded that we are living in paradise here on Earth. Oh. This is the Garden of Eden, and we have failed to appreciate it. So from the deadness of the moon, there's no life anywhere outside of this planet that we know of. The extraordinary gift that this planet has given us is what led them to that conclusion. And of course, from the point of view of saving the planet, they are all just, horrified at what we're doing to it. And Mike Collins, who was on, the Apollo 11 mission, said to me, we have to find a way to achieve prosperity without growth. And if you think about that for a moment, what he's essentially questioning is capitalism as it exists today, where there is just this endlessly rapacious need to keep extracting more and more of the Earth's resources in a way that's not sustainable. And I don't think that anybody would disagree with that. I mean, there are people who deny climate change. I would say that they're probably in the minority. But this was it was quite something to hear it from the men who went to the moon.
Well, I have a question to ask you because I felt it was such a profound inclusion in the book, and that is the statements that you wrote that Adlai Stevenson made and Jesse Jackson made at the time of the launch, because they're valid today, unfortunately.
Sure.
And we're trying to be hopeful and to go on, but we still have that oppressed section of society, and this tragedy around the world. And how do you see that from that day to now?
Well, I think Shelley and Scott, there's always been this tug of war between the impulse that humanity has had to explore and the need to address, the more pressing issues at home, poverty. And, as Jackson said, we can't get an ambulance from one end of the inner city to another. Of course, back then they were calling it a ghetto. They no longer referred to, poverty-stricken areas that way. But I think at the end of the day, if you go back and you ask the Reverend Jackson about that now, I think that he would conclude, as did Ralph Abernathy, who was against the moon program, that the spin-off benefits were just so profound that it was a worthwhile expenditure. Whether it trickled down into the poverty-stricken areas is is another question. My guess is that it has, in ways that are not immediately obvious, like weather satellites, the ability to now communicate in ways that were not possible 50 and 60 years ago.
True. All
So
the spin-off
I think,
technology.
yes, correct. That's right. Exactly.
It also, in the most simple way, had gotten people to look up with wonder, and realize that maybe this is my head tilts back, and I'm looking at a place now that humans have been. And I feel sad that we haven't been back. I
Sure.
hope that we continue and find a way. And I think about my own state on the day they took off for the moon, because when they took off for the moon, I went into labor that night.
Wow.
And I was in the hospital, and my daughter was born an hour and 25 minutes after they blasted off.
Fantastic.
That was my moonshot.
That was your moonshot.
That was
I love
my
it.
moonshot.
That's great.
Yeah.
So they said, where are you? I will never forget.
Yeah.
Would you like to go to space today? Would you like to be a space tourist?
Absolutely. I mean, if somebody said that I could, go to the moon right now and walk on its surface, I wouldn't even think twice about it. The answer is absolutely yes.
Right.
Sure.
And the vomit comet? Would you go?
I would do whatever it
To get up.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
Okay.
Right. Basil, I wanted to ask you, when you broached the religious part of this, because it gets very, these astronauts were changed, okay,
Sure.
upon seeing the Earth rise, or somehow trying to balance out the starkness, the deadness of the moon versus this beautiful, glowing blue-white orb. Was that hard to discuss with the Eagles? Was it, or were they just ready to talk about it? And also, how did it affect you?
Well, they were ready to talk about it because, it's sort of been a ban, an embargo.
Yeah.
Back in the 60s and early 70s from them discussing the religious issue because they didn't want to affect the program. You'll remember that NASA was actually sued in 1968 for the Genesis broadcast that Lovell, Anders, and Borman conducted on Christmas Eve. They read from the book of Genesis.
Yes,
Right.
people thought it would be exclusionary.
Yeah.
And they were trying to preserve it for all. Yes.
So they got, God shy at that point.
Right.
They didn't want to talk about their personal views. So here we are 50 years later, and nobody had really talked to them about it. And so, they were eager to discuss it. And so, you had, as I mentioned, Lovell, who's quite religious. Same thing with Frank Borman. Interestingly, their third crewmate, Bill Anders, wound up, the day of the launch, he was a practicing Catholic. He comes back 3 days later, a complete agnostic, and found Catholicism, to just be not believable in his eyes, and as he said, to think that God sits up there with a supercomputer is just ridiculous.
Right.
You had others like Alan Bean, who was the fourth man to walk on the moon, and who was the only artist of the group. He dedicated his life to paintings of the lunar landings, and so. He had actually been a lay minister and taught Sunday school and what have you. He had come to the conclusion that there was not a God before he went to the moon. So he was not impacted that way. Others, like Ed Mitchell, who founded the School of Noetics, decided that we were somehow it had almost a Star Wars kind of a force-like edge to it, in which he believed that we're all connected. The molecules in this computer, and then you and me, that we've all, our molecules were prototyped in an ancient generation of stars, and we were all connected galactically. So there's some just fascinating descriptions and assessments of this. Mike Collins said that he finds God more in the coral reef than he does in the cathedral. People have automatically assumed that he's an atheist, and he's not. Quite the opposite. Mm-hmm. I think overall, they kind of came to the conclusion that Einstein did, which was that we have to sort of bow down in awe of the unknowable, and that the one thing that we can certainly count on is the order of the universe. Mm-hmm. And these guys relied on the laws of physics for their lives.
For their lives,
right?
And so they saw demonstrated in real time in space those laws of physics. And if they were wrong, if Einstein had been wrong or Newton had been wrong, they were dead men.
Right.
So they came out of it with a newfound appreciation for Einstein's and Newton's laws of physics and the order of the universe.
I think it's so interesting that the age at which you interviewed the astronauts, and I find many people as they approach their 80s, for example, mm-hmm. and they have worked their lives for a almost tangible answer.
Sure.
They embrace the teachings that they had when they were younger, mm-hmm. and there are answers we don't have yet, and so right. This kind of gives peace, perhaps.
It does. It does, and they also have some really interesting takes on. They've all concluded that there is life elsewhere. They see it as a mathematical certainty, as Enrico Fermi, who was the Italian physicist and worked on the Manhattan Project, he concluded that statistically it was a virtual certainty that there was life on other planets. But then, he uttered what came to be known as Fermi's paradox, which was, well, if that's the case, where is everyone?
Yeah, where are they?
So, and what the Eagles would say to that mm-hmm. is that the universe is so vast that if there were intelligent life out there, the odds of our ever finding each other would be, zip to none. So
right.
May I ask you, because I thought that the passages about Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are very interesting.
Yes.
And I think they are giving people dreams and a future. Mm-hmm. And how do you find the differences in what they're trying to do? I mean, Bezos very close, sticking close to Gerard O'Neill's teachings, which was his professor, right?
Yes.
And Elon Musk, a really good physicist, and he knows what he doesn't know, and he can hire people who do know.
Sure.
But their goals are slightly different. What do you feel about those directions?
Well, Bezos would argue that he is an optimist, and that the reason to leave and explore the rest of the universe is not because the Earth is played out, which would be the more dystopian view mm-hmm. that Elon Musk has expressed, which is that, hey, folks, the Earth is done. Mm-hmm. We got to get out of here. and there are a lot of people who believe that. Bezos would say, no, we have to go out there in order to save the Earth. So he doesn't see it as, planet B or plan B. He has a plan A, which is to, go out there and build solar powered, orbiting factories out there to help, the Earth sustain itself in terms of its energy uses and what have you. What's interesting is to see who the Eagles have more faith in space exploration.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Very interesting.
Fantastic. Mm-hmm. Fantastic answer. But they are speaking of a future in future reality. And I think that's exciting young people.
It is.
And
it is. And
I think that's what we need.
Yeah.
It is. And we also need to have a clear articulation of the goals for the space program from Washington and the president. What was extraordinary about Kennedy was, if you think about it, if you really have to immerse yourself in the context of the time, 1961, and President Eisenhower, whom Kennedy succeeded, thought that Kennedy was nuts, that this talk of going to the moon was just some ludicrous fantasy. And there were plenty of people who believed that. And NASA itself didn't think it was possible to do it in the time frame that Kennedy was suggesting. So you need somebody who has a bold vision and then is willing to back it up with dollars.
Yes.
Right.
And Congress did that. Kennedy was determined that the program get off the ground. So, he appointed James Webb, who was an inspired choice because he had served both in private industry and in government. He had been Truman's head of office management and budget. Mm-hmm. So he knew where to find the money in Congress. And he told Kennedy, look, you need to double your budget here. It isn't going to cost, $7 billion. It's going to cost double,
at least
2.5 times that.
Right.
And Kennedy listened. And also, Webb saw to it that Congress got its nest feathered and made sure that, it was no accident that the Kennedy Space Center wound up being what is now the Johnson Space Center, wound up being located in Houston, Texas, because Texas is where the head of the House Appropriations Committee was from, and the rest is history. So
I think it's interesting because this is a problem today too. When we started talking about private enterprise taking on such a big role, it's going to be interesting to see where we go, just as it is if we mine asteroids, for example. And there's no space treaty since 1967. Mm-hmm. So we haven't decided who owns what, and it'd be like the gold rush.
Right.
Yes, it would be, and it would be, you can go back a few centuries from there and see what happened to, the New World when, the explorers and the leading nations of the day really pillaged, this part of the world, and you have to hope that this will not be the case as we go back to the moon. And there's already the possibility, particularly with something called helium-3,
yes,
which revolutionized the nuclear power industry here on planet Earth. Mm-hmm. And if the same thing happens with helium-3 that happened with, gold and spices in the New World, we're in trouble.
Yeah. Basil, you talked a lot about the motivations and stuff behind this. In 1961, I'm 1 year old. Okay. Certainly, I grew up watching the Apollo program, but how? I mean, was the United States, were people that afraid of the advances that Russia had? I mean, was that the impetus for us to spend billions and billions of dollars to go to the moon and to do something that a lot of people thought was crazy and impossible? And what's it going to take to do it again?
Well, the Cold War, there's no question that the Cold War was the motivating force behind the moon landings. We never would have taken it on had it not been for the Cold War and the fact that the Russians had gotten to space first with Sputnik, then with Yuri Gagarin as the first man to orbit the Earth. They were so far. Well, I don't want to say so far. They were ahead of us in those firsts, and there was a very real fear on the part of Congress and the business and scientific community that the Russians might beat us. And of course, Nikita Khrushchev was suggesting that this was evidence of communism being a superior economic and social system to capitalism.
Sure.
So, that they
could get it done first. Yeah.
And, all of our leaders were concerned that we had to show otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We have a question here from one of the viewers here, and this is from Ron Delval. And he's asking, were any of the astronauts worried about cancer concerning their exposure to the space environment now that they're older?
Well, they were at the time worried about radiation exposure. So let's all remember that there was absolutely no research that anybody could point to, because we had simply never left the Earth to go to the moon. And the Van Allen radiation belt, no one knew what would happen to them in what's known as that cislunar corridor. Mm-hmm. That's 230,000 area miles between the Earth and the Moon. And so it was no accident that they picked Anders, who was a rookie, to go on Apollo 8 because he had gotten his master's in nuclear engineering. So he had on board with him a Geiger counter, okay? And so they were concerned that, the radiation would penetrate the spacecraft. As it turned out, there wasn't any real measurable radiation penetrating the spacecraft. It was probably more of a concern for the guys who were actually walking on the moon, because all they had was their spacesuits, separating them from that and radiation. And who knows? I mean, so far, I would have to go back and check, but no one is able to directly say that somebody died of cancer from, people had heart issues and what have you, but that may have been the case whether they went to the moon or not.
Right.
So
it's interesting because they're also talking about a cislunar position again, right? There's they've been talking about building a kind of living space station.
Yes.
This lunar point, and I think these are the things we have to do.
Correct.
We have to do it.
The greater question is, what we do know is that the radiation in deep space, the trip from Earth to Mars, that would be a whole different ballgame.
Yeah.
And in fact, Anders told me that he says that we have yet to create a spacecraft that could withstand the radiation that would penetrate. And the same for being on the surface of Mars. I mean, you would have to live subterraneally. So there is no spacecraft, there are no materials or alloys that have yet to be invented that would protect us.
Yeah, I don't even think we have the spacesuits yet for the moon, which is supposed to be 2024. It's not going to happen. It's not yet. And I think it's quite interesting that we know these things and we've given a date that we might not be able to meet that date because we're not progressing as we should in the fine details of life support.
Sure.
Humans.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I think it's wildly optimistic to suggest, as some people have, that we'll be on Mars by 2025. That's absurd.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we haven't built a colony on the moon yet, right? So.
Correct.
It's interesting because I know Isa has been training in caves and talking about lava tubes, and maybe being able to stay, live, work within a lava tube to protect from radiation. And, after I think it was the JAXA found a lava tube on the moon that they were very interested in. So they photographed it, and I think robots or who goes back is going to definitely examine that point. It's exciting.
Sure.
Maybe our robots will 3D print things and live there and work it out so that we'll have a habitat when we go back that will be protective and safe.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, certainly the Eagles see the moon as a staging area for deep space exploration, and their hope is that we can set up, scientific colonies on the moon, and that will be the purpose of a return there, and not to exploit the moon's resources. And interestingly, Neil Armstrong said something which was truly extraordinary. He concluded that we had not yet advanced enough as humans to go colonize any place, and that we had to clean up our act on Earth before we decided to go out there and, populate another planet.
Well, I think that's always been the issue, right? Take your bad habits with you. How are we going? Who's going to have the right stuff in the future? What is the right stuff in the future?
We have to ask the bigger question: what is it that we hope to export to another planet? Especially if there's life on that planet. And let's assume for a moment that it's primitive, but
viable,
one that would be hospitable to humans.
Yes.
And then what do you do? I mean, let's say that it was a planet that was like Earth, say 50,000 years ago. Yeah. Or the equivalent of the cavemen. What is it that we're going to get those cavemen to do?
Yeah, and I think also we have to study better so that we can recognize something that is not recognizable yet.
Sure.
We have to use imagination in this new biology.
Absolutely.
Because we keep looking for ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know, big or small, but I want to see something different. I'm ready to go.
We have another question here.
Sure.
Ron said that he said there seemed to be a little disappointment with the astronauts going to the moon. What was your take? I mean, certainly some of them spoke of just seeing this utterly dead, lifeless terrain. Stark. But what was your take from their experience?
Well, you had they all, as they all said, it was magnificent in its own way, or as Buzz Aldrin said, magnificent desolation. So there was a stark beauty to it, though it was lifeless. But again, it was the ability to reframe their thinking about the Earth And even Al Shepard, who was considered, the least sort of emotional of the 12 men who walked on the moon, and a real kind of fighter pilot, he said that if anybody had said to me before I went out there that I'd get all emotional, I'd have said they're crazy. And yet he was the one astronaut who cried when he looked up at the Earth, and he admitted to it. Mm-hmm. So there was this twin emotion of absolute awe at what they were finding on the moon, but even a greater awe for Earth, and how colorful a jewel it was hanging in this black void.
Yeah. I think any of us would like to see that ourselves,
Sure.
Right?
It was like a cosmic lighthouse, the Earth.
And how many of them had you written about that said there were no borders, there were no boundaries? It was one beautiful orb.
Yes.
So, and as we need to hear that more as we divide and separate in these days, because if we don't do it as a species on the planet, we'll be divided and somebody will conquer, but it won't be us.
Yeah, and it was interesting, back to Mike Collins again, who is just an endless source of marvelous observations. He reminded me of what they encountered on their world trip after they came back. Mm-hmm. And he said everywhere we went, everyone kept using the pronoun we. Mm. And they would say, we did it. Not you Americans did it, but we humans did this.
That's right.
It was one and only time that he had heard that. And we have digressed so far from that point. There was just that rare moment in human history where there was this collective we.
Yeah.
And
it's a uniter, not a divider.
Right.
It was marvelous. It was,
and that has vanished.
Yes.
And, President Kennedy himself said, not too long before he was assassinated, we all inhabit this small planet, and we all, breathe the same air, and we all share, the same dreams. And it was a beautiful articulation of that we sentiment.
I think that's fantastic, Basil. I think that kind of wraps it up. Is there, Shelley, do you have any other questions or anything else you'd like to bring up?
I would just like to say thank you for putting this book and these ideas back into the world.
Well, thank you to both of you for inviting me. This has been a real genuine pleasure and honor, and I appreciate it.
Well, it's very nice. It's nice to have you. You're in your home. It's nice and informal, and I can tell you're relaxed, and it's fantastic to have you on, Basil. So thank you very much. I will share this all over Facebook, and there is a link to Basil's book if you haven't already read it. It's a great read. Let me pull the camera up. Mission of a Lifetime. So. And I think you'll find that it gives you just such a great perspective and reframes so many things and answers a lot of questions that you might not have had answers to. So thank you very much, Basil.
Thank you all. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Right, here we go.